Hello again and welcome. We now get to the French Revolution and Napoleon. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. You can probably translate into English yourself. Liberty, equality, fraternity. A phrase that's become associated with the revolution, but wasn't, I think, first spoken or written until well into the revolution. This is one of the biggest, most important events in our class. Hence, it's going to be a big unit, especially when we figure in the Napoleon part of it, which will come in a separate lecture just after this. A poet of the time in France said, "If we succeed, the destiny of Europe will be changed. Men will regain their rights, and people their sovereignty," basically, which means their freedom. Was he right about this? Did it change the destiny of Europe? He said if we succeed, it would have changed the destiny of Europe even if it had failed, just in a different way. So the French Revolution is next up. Well, let me get that for you. Yep, I did it all by myself. I know, it's impressive. So the impact of the revolution. And a couple of questions right from the start. Can a bloody revolution ever be justified? I'm not proposing to answer these questions per se, more rhetorical questions, though you might ponder them and think about them as we go through this and as you study, assuming you do study after this for the next exam. Can this one be justified in particular? And another way to kind of say this, was this violent upheaval good for France and Europe in the long term? And many different historians have had numerous different diverse takes on this question. I would say it's a tough call. We'll get sort of more into this, of course, but it changed Europe undoubtedly, and there is no going back. So whether if you lived at the time, whether you liked the outcome of the French Revolution, despised it, you knew that there was no going back. Europe changed dramatically, for good or bad, or both, and everyone knew it. Among many other long-term effects of this revolution, it ushered in two of the three, or I said three, I meant three of the five modern European political isms: socialism, nationalism, and conservatism. And we'll see a little bit about how those come about, although conservatism will pick up more in another unit, but we'll at least mention these as we go forth. Interpretations of the French Revolution. So as I said, this is one of the most studied events or series of events in all of European history, and there's a great deal of disagreement even now about what we're to make of the revolution. Was it a success? If so, are there elements of it that can be criticized? Certainly the Reign of Terror, as we'll see, is usually roundly criticized by every historian. And there are different schools of thought on this as well. Marxist historians, left-leaning historians, a lot of those in France, but some Americans and Brits as well, have often seen this as a typical class revolution, and the author of our textbook, Professor Perry, basically presents it that way overall, although he's not a Marxist historian himself. So, was this a typical class revolution? I think, again, the answer to that is open to a debate, and it is debated. Simon Schama, British scholar whose book you see on the right there, he takes issue with that in this very book called Citizens. But for the purposes of teaching, for pedagogical reasons, I think there's reason to present the revolution as a class revolution, to basically take on the Marxist interpretation or framework for now. I don't usually like Marxist interpretations, not because of the word. I just don't think they usually hold up to critical scrutiny, and I'm not sure it does entirely here as well, but it is good for explanatory purposes. We can put the revolution in some sort of framework that I think simplifies our understanding of it. That's part of the reason maybe it's not an overall accurate description of the revolution in the end, is because of the word simply. History isn't ever simple, but sometimes we need to simplify to understand, especially when we're doing a survey like we are here. Georges Lefebvre, one of the most famous French historians on the Revolution, called this an episode in the general rise of the bourgeoisie. So bourgeoisie, of course, is Karl Marx's later term for the middle class, and Lefebvre himself is one of those many historians that see it in typical traditional class terms. In France, there were the three estates, as they were known, the first, second, and third. It might surprise you to know that the first estate was actually the Roman Catholic clergy. Second estate was the nobility, though the two of them really are the same class, because at least if you get higher than priests in the Catholic Church, you're likely to have come from a noble family. So, but the nobles is about 2% of the population, and they owned a much larger chunk of land than their 2%. So out of proportion to their numbers. The third estate included everybody else: the workers in the cities, the professions, professors, doctors, lawyers, etc., and the peasants, meaning the poor farmers, who were about 80% of the population themselves. So the city workers and the middle-class professionals are a fairly small number of people, but the third estate also includes, as it says here, wealthy merchants and bankers and traders, manufacturers who aren't nobles. So you have to have some category, some bucket to put the super wealthy non-nobles in. So they're in the third estate. So they're not nobles. Some of them move from one to the other, as we've seen in other lectures, particularly when we've talked about Great Britain. We'll come back to this. The estates are going to become important, but you'll see why. The dual crisis of 1789. So what brought the French Revolution on? Well, a lot of long-term phenomenon, a lot of sort of impersonal forces, sometimes bad decisions by leaders. But in the short term, the crisis that France found itself in that led to the revolution was a very unfortunate conjunction of crises. And what does conjunction mean? Perhaps you know, or at least you know, the overall generic dictionary definition meaning of it. But in history, it means sort of when two separate sort of lines or trends of development in history that are unrelated before haphazardly, coincidentally, sort of collide with each other. And it sort of creates an emergent property of sorts, and something new and unexpected is the result. So bad harvests, not just for 1 year, but you see in the upper left, for many of the years of the 1780s, sometimes through drought, sometimes through cold and rainy weather, winters that lasted well into spring, which ruined the crop. So cold and hot weather throughout the 1780s in many years caused growing crisis. Bad harvests with less and less food coming in. Of course, the economic way that that's seen is through prices going through the roof for food, but it can be other things as well. So not just, it says bad harvest, but this is a number of bad harvests that lead to people being on the verge of famine, high prices for food, and all kinds of strange things that happen. But the poor harvests left the peasants less able, sometimes unable, to meet their already high tax burden. And the heavy tax burden now more difficult because of the financial crisis. So this has sort of everyone in a jam. The peasants, of course, are now extra resentful at noble privilege, like exemption from taxation and things like this. So they'd already become resentful through the course of the century, particularly at noble privilege, and we'll see what some of those are. But in a huge crisis like this, understandably, they become even more sensitive to all the ways in which the nobles have it made, especially compared to themselves. The second crisis, the two collide and they overlap, they're related to each other in some ways, the tax system, again, bearing heavily on the peasantry, who paid most of the taxes, and when taxes were raised, they were usually raised on the peasants. So those that can afford to pay taxes least in France, this is true really throughout Europe in this age, are the ones who pay it most, or almost all of it. This financial crisis then hits the peasantry hard. But why is France in so much debt to the point where they have to keep increasing taxation, or they do keep increasing it? And the primary reason is warfare. 2 wars back to back, the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, were ruinously expensive wars for France. They lost the first one and were on the winning side in the second one, sort of. The Americans certainly achieved their independence. France was sort of more split in what they got out of it. Nonetheless, both of those wars together, only about 20 years apart from each other, 10 years apart from each other, took its toll on the finances of the country. The French tried to and did some marketing of bonds. We know that already the British are experts at doing this, and France is a good contrast. Britain, remember, was brilliant at using bonds to pay for warfare along with taxes. The square of power that we talked about before in England worked exceptionally well. It's one of the reasons Great Britain wins the 7 Years' War, and others didn't win the American Revolution, but we know, or should know by now, that Great Britain is really the #1 power economically and militarily in the world, or at least in Europe. Harder to kind of compare around the world, arguably the world. But they had a hard time in France marketing bonds because the government just wasn't nearly as stable. Lots of corruption, inefficiencies, and investors don't like corruption and inefficiency. This is why the square of power worked so well in Great Britain. Parliament was relatively uncorrupt, much more efficient than any other government of the time. And so the French had a hard time, going into debt to pay off anything. But they're, of course, trying to get out of debt in the first place. But what I'm saying is that sometimes you can go into further debt to take care of more immediate debt. But that road was basically closed off. Realistically, it's a huge sum of money that they owe because of we just said about corruption and inefficiency. The influence of the Enlightenment and American Revolution. So now we get to sort of more long-term influences. I don't know if you can say, you can't say that these are causes of the French Revolution, but they did sort of lay a foundation for a revolution, at least when the time came. The Enlightenment, I think we can see in a lot of obvious ways how this could support, prepare a country, prepare people to think in revolutionary terms, to even consider the possibility of rising up against your own government. Immamel Kant, one of the great Enlightenment thinkers, though we didn't really talk about him in class, famously said in an essay called "What is Enlightenment?" "Dare to know. Have the courage to use your own intelligence." But what if you use your own intelligence to criticize your government because you believe it's tyrannical and not effective? Then you're likely to talk to other people about it and maybe try to do something about it. So the Enlightenment certainly helped to lead, again, laid the groundwork for revolution. It's, I think, a good question to ask: could the French Revolution have happened without the Enlightenment? My educated guess on this would be no, though we can't, of course, prove it. But that's not to say that the Enlightenment is, anything close to the factor explaining the revolution. What about the American Revolution? Well, it's partly based on Enlightenment thought to begin with. The American founders, including Jefferson, whose words you see here, name, he was an Enlightenment educated individual, Enlightenment thinker and writer through and through. So were all of his famous colleagues. So all of them had read their Voltaire and their Rousseau, Montesquieu, Adam Smith, etc., etc. So in a sense, these two are issues are overlapping. But the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, we'll see that this does, in some ways, have a direct impact on the French Revolution, the words in particular. But there's no doubt that the French were looking at the American Revolution and sort of took inspiration from it and even tried to copy some of its values, ideology, etc. However, there is some real reason to question whether these revolutions are truly comparable or not. Were they really similar to each other? Meaning the American Revolution, which came about 10 years before the French. And I think the answer is that they're largely not similar. I mean, you can find similarities and dissimilarities in just about anything you compare and contrast. But overall, I think that there's more differences, or at least those differences are of greater importance than the similarities. The American Revolution, first of all, overthrowing an imperial government as subjects of that government. The French Revolution was entirely internal. So in some ways, it's kind of like an apples to oranges. We call them both revolutions, but they're different affairs. Again, there's some similarities too, but the values are different. One other difference of great importance is that, for reasons we don't have time to get into, the American revolutionaries ended up being revolutionaries with a suit and a tie. Not literally, but extremely responsible, and recognized early on that a violent sort of overthrow of any government, whether overseas or your own at home, can lead to chaos, can lead to tyranny, can lead to irrationality. And so they took measures from the beginning to make this sort of a sane, responsible revolution. I know that seems like an oxymoron, responsible revolution, but they did it. They pulled it off. One current American historian calls the American Revolution an explosion in slow motion. And the French Revolution, if it was an explosion, it certainly wasn't in slow motion. And this one, unfortunately for the French and Europeans who were negatively affected by it, again, there's positive effects too. We'll look at both sides. But nonetheless, this was not a revolution, in the end anyway, at its crucial moments, led by leaders with a suit and a tie, who were responsible revolutionaries trying to make sure that after they succeeded, while they were succeeding, that their revolution didn't get out of control and create more problems than they needed, or more problems than what they previously had. There's real reason to question that in the case of the French Revolution. This brings us to the famous Louis XVI and the more famous Marie Antoinette, his wife and queen. Did I say 14th? Louis XVI. And I've said it before, but Louis XVI is no Louis XIV. He's related to him, but didn't quite have the same ability. Louis XVI wasn't a dumb guy, but he was rather simple in the way he, I don't mean simple-minded, but rather simple in the way he approached life and the way he approached his monarchy. So certainly not a dynamic leader in any way, which is a problem as well. So the monarchy, the king in particular, do bear some responsibility for the events that unfolded that we now call the French Revolution. I asked the question there on the screen. How much, we won't get into, but that's debatable and debated as well. Marie Antoinette was hated by the French, really from the beginning, because she was Austrian. Remember, France's longtime enemy and rival were the Austrian Habsburgs, and she was the sister of the current emperor of the Habsburg domains and the Holy Roman Empire. So this had one strike against her from the moment she first stepped onto French soil and territory, and it would only get worse. And certainly she and her husband, the royal family as a whole, their whole coterie and court, didn't make it any easier on themselves when the time came for people to sort of have the public to have their fate, the royal family's fate, in their own hands, revolutionary leaders having their fate in their hands, that they lived extremely lavishly, but kings and queens always do, but in an out-of-touch fashion, apparently not being aware or caring about the suffering and the needs of everyday average people, peasant, farmers, and such. Marie Antoinette is famous for saying, "Let them eat cake," which she probably didn't ever say, but it's still a nice phrase to remember, and kind of makes an important point that is true, even if she didn't say it. And so, let's just assume for the sake of argument that she did say it. What did she mean? What would she have meant? A servant of hers is supposed to have said, "But your majesty, the people have no bread." And her response was, "Then let them eat cake." And this shows an out of touch, with your people way of thinking, because it's like she's saying, "Oh, they don't have any bread. Well, why don't they just go to the refrigerator and get a steak, or make us, have some caviar, have some ice cream, have bacon and eggs. So what? They don't have bread." And so what she's misunderstanding, of course, is no, that's not an option. All they have to eat ever is bread. And so when they have no bread, what we're saying is they have no food. So she probably didn't say this, but it's probably true that she thought like this. And the phrase, it's famous, and so it's an easy way to remember the point. To show how sort of out of touch or outside of the, to put it in modern parlance, how much the monarchy appears to have been living in a bubble, in their own little world. The Queen had this little fantasy village built, which is still around because it's a photograph you see below. She had this little village built that she'd go and hang out with and have parties with her friends, and but she even had peasants and servants that she would have dress up in like medieval costumes. It was like a Renaissance fair just for her. So you could, if we thought about this in strictly Marxist, harsh terms, and there's some reason to think this, although I wouldn't push it as far as such an historian would, but this is appalling that people are living, like this in their own little fantasy land, while just miles away people are starving to death, partly because of the huge taxation that's collected to pay for all of this. So there is an element of truth in that, to be sure. The peasantry, 80% of the country by this time, was long suffering. So were the working class in Paris and the other cities, shopkeepers and artisans, shoemakers, etc. They were taxed from numerous directions, all peasants and poor people, especially the peasants. Peasant farmers were often or always taxed from three different directions. The king, the monarchy, 1, nobility, 2, and the tithe, T-I-T-H-E, tithe, the Catholic, the sort of main church of the Catholic, the main tax of the Catholic Church. And this wasn't, this is obligatory. They didn't have an option. So they're being taxed 3 ways to Sunday, and there are other taxes in there as well. Other services they have to provide by law. The paying of nobles' taxes was particularly and increasingly resented in the 18th century and up to the Revolution, because it smacked of the Middle Ages, and so it seemed backward, and in many ways was backward. Peasants had little access to education, were usually struggling so badly, particularly in this century, that their diet was poor, their lives were difficult, and they were, of course, then vulnerable to any economic downturn that came down the pike. And we know that one does in the 1780s in all of these bad harvest years. On the other side, and you can see a big difference just in the pictures, I'm just going to pick a couple of things, but they'll certainly make the point. Nobles were almost always 100% exempt from taxation. That's right, you heard that correctly. 100% exempt. So the people that can afford to pay taxes, the people that can contribute the most to the government coffers, don't pay anything at all. They pay no taxes. And that had been true for hundreds of years, and it was a privilege that the nobility guarded very closely and weren't going to give up easily without a fight, if at all. Among many exclusive privileges, meaning privileges that they had that non-nobles didn't have, written into law and custom and tradition, were exclusive hunting rights. This is one of the most resented privileges of all, which sounds odd to the modern ear, but if you think about it for a second, it makes sense. So the people who could use hunting the most to supplement their diets and income, if you can go out and hunt deer or whatever it is and use it for food, for a poor peasant family, that could be a serious supplement to your income monthly. And so, but they have no right to hunt anywhere. It's illegal everywhere. Not that no one ever did it and got away with it. It'd be hard to police all of the forests and wilderness land in France, but you could get in trouble. People sometimes did if they tried. And the nobles had the exclusive right to hunt and could go basically anywhere they wanted, even on someone else's land. And think about why the nobles are hunting. Are they hunting because they need food? The cupboard is bare, nothing in the fridge? No, they're hunting for sport, for fun, for leisure. So the huge majority of the population that could really use hunting can't do it at all. And those that don't need it at all are the only ones who get to do it, and they're doing it just for fun. So among the actual injustices here, this is a sort of symbolic injustice that's just glaring to the people of France, as the 18th century goes on. To solve the financial crisis, Louis XVI brought back into power as his finance minister a guy named Jacques Necker, a high-profile figure then and now. But Necker had been finance minister before and been let go for reasons we won't get into, having nothing to do with his talent. He was talented, and that's why he was brought back here, because the financial crisis came to a head in 1788, and sort of helped to, again, it's kind of the spark that brought on the French Revolution. So called back into service, and he knew, as other finance ministers that had been there, between his last stint and this new one, that the only way out of this was to start taxing the nobility for the first time ever. But he also knew it was going to be a delicate issue, and he seems to have given Louis XVI sage advice, advising the king after the Estates General backfired. We're going to get to that. To make reforms and move to a constitutional monarchy before it was too late. So, but Louis XVI didn't make that move, didn't move really at all on this issue until way too late, which cost him dearly. He stayed on to advise, Necker that is, the new National Assembly, which we're also going to get to, which means the first revolutionary government, as the monarchy is pushed aside, albeit temporarily at first, and he advises them on his in his field of expertise, financial matters. But eventually he became frustrated at the revolutionary government's poor decisions. At the same time, he was eventually sort of suspected of not being a true revolutionary, and the revolutionary government was having increasing problems with him, so they allowed him to leave the country. Which was actually quite generous of them. We'll see that the French Revolution isn't actually known for being that generous to the rich and powerful, or at least the formerly rich and powerful. So getting to leave the country was, he was kind of around at the right time, early on. Otherwise, that wouldn't have, that courtesy would not have been extended to him. So we move to the two stages of the French Revolution. This is the framework that our textbook uses as well. The moderate stage, 1789 to 1991, and then we'll get to the radical stage. And at this stage of the revolution, sticking to the kind of class framework that we talked about up front, this can be seen then as the working class, the peasants, and the middle class merchants, middle class lawyers, doctors, all seeing that they had something in common, at least perceived in common, and that was that they believed they were being abused, and they're by the nobility and the monarchy, by the government, and that their interests were not being met. Their needs, their desires were not being met. So they basically teamed up. But because it was the much more well-educated, if educated at all, in terms of the lower classes, middle class, who led this movement, then in this first couple of years, with mostly middle-class revolutionary leaders, the revolution stayed on sane terms. It still was radical, considering the time, 18th century, but it was still sort of within kind of the Enlightenment tradition in many ways. Many of the Enlightenment ideas were radical themselves, but it wasn't crazy. The radical phase, we'll see, gets really out of control. So at this point, you could actually say that the revolution early on was closer to the American Revolution. These were more responsible revolutionaries in charge, even though there is some signs, even at the beginning, that things are not so going to stay that way. Around the time that this whole crisis started to heat up, lots of debate and questioning in French society about what the monarchy is going to do with regard to the debt crisis, etc. A clergyman named Abbé Sieyès penned a screed called "What is the Third Estate?" An essay that became a smash hit, sort of like the equivalent, rough equivalent of Thomas Paine's Common Sense during the American Revolution a decade earlier. So this took off, but it was a scathing critique of the nobility, and a sort of a statement claiming that we don't even need them. He famously said, Sieyès was at that point a low-ranking member of the clergy. He actually went on to survive the revolution and come out the other side as one of the leaders of France for a short time. But he says in this essay, what is the third estate? Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it ask? To become something. So it's rather blunt and clear and concise. He pulls no punches, and he makes everything crystal clear. And you can brush up on your French, if you like, by reading it over on the left-hand side, or at least part of it. So he's more or less saying it's the workers, the businessmen, the educated professionals, the peasants who produce the food, that do everything in France. And the second estate does nothing. Right? The nobility doesn't do anything, which wasn't entirely true. So this is hyperbole. This is a polemic. But there was some truth to it, a grain of truth in it. He's exaggerating. So, and he goes on to actually say, how different would France be if we woke up, one morning and the nobility had just vanished? He'd say it would be the same because they don't contribute anyway. So this was inflammatory, certainly for the time, but it came kind of right at the moment where things were about to take off. Things were about to explode. Also written around this time are the now well-known cahiers, kind of means notebook in French, which certainly foreshadowed what lay ahead. And the cahiers were written after the king, Louis XVI, called into session the Estates General, which we'll get back to. And between the time he called it and they actually were able to set up this convocation of leaders from across France, which is a number of months. In the meantime, throughout every region of France, every locale, like the equivalent of a county today, wrote these notebooks. And actually, in each area, there were members of each estate, first, second, and third, that wrote up their cahiers. But the ones that were the most critical in the end, most important, so the one we're talking about, are those written by the third estate. And the cahiers usually were written by members of the middle class, not the peasants. So lawyers, most of the time, or businessmen who were educated, would be the ones that wrote this. But they were writing down grievances, grievances of their own against the monarchy, against the system, and the peasants' grievances as well. Because remember, at this point in the revolution, the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and the peasants/workers are on the same side. But the leaders, as you see in this, are the middle class, mainly because of their education. Sometimes they had some clout as well. So this long list of festering grievances, building for a long, long time. We already know about exclusive hunting rights, excessive taxation, too many taxes, they're too high, corruption in government, anger at noble privileges in general of all kinds. There were even demands for written constitution, a national legislature, etc., etc. So the Third Estate, then, when the Estates General finally opened months later, they came prepared, they already were there, with notes, with sort of organized laundry list of grievances and demands, and they were going to be heard, at least from their perspective. It appears that the king and the monarchy kind of walked into this so obsessed with the financial crisis, as you would expect, that they were kind of blinded by what was going to happen with regard to the Third Estate. Meaning that the Third Estate wasn't just there to talk about the financial crisis, they were there to air out all of these grievances. And the king didn't seem to have realized that. So when the Estates General convened in 1789, and I like this particular painting of it because it gives you a sense of the gravity of the situation. This is a rather serious, solemn, formal occasion. Representatives of all three estates from all over France sort of in one meeting. So the grand occasion looked like it was going to be of historical significance, but it never really got off the ground. And for one simple reason. There was an immediate disagreement from members of the Third Estate, their leaders. By the way, they basically elected or selected leaders to go from each region, county, whatever you want to call it, to the Estates General. So, but they immediately, sort of before they allowed anything to get started, said we have to change the voting procedure. And the voting procedure was old and traditional indeed, because the Estates General, which could have actually turned into a parliament type legislature that met permanently, hadn't actually met until 1789, until 1614. That's right, 1614. So about 160 years, whatever that is, it hadn't met since then, because kings could call it at their leisure. And so it hadn't ever taken hold and taken root as sort of a firmly in place institution like Parliament across the English Channel had in London. And so you can see that just partly because of the amount of time that went by, but also in their procedures. So, and it's clear why the Third Estate wasn't going to let things go forward until the voting system was changed. Because the old way of doing it, going back to 1614, and I guess before, I don't remember in previous meetings, but all of the representatives, think of these guys as politicians, they basically are, at least temporarily, and from each estate, if there's a measure, a bill, they're talking about debating a law, there's a yes and a no vote. So if however many hundreds of representatives there are from the first estate, the clergy, if they vote a majority of one, a yes, then it's one vote yes for the clergy. Then the nobility, all of its hundreds of representatives, they vote on the same issue, same bill, and they vote in a majority by one. so barely a majority, but that counts as then one vote also for yes. And so 2 yes votes now, and the third estate, which is larger in number in terms of representatives, Jacques Necker, aforementioned, did get the king beforehand to agree to increase the number of members from the third estate because he knew that would have been an issue as well, since it would have been very much underrepresented. It still was underrepresented since it's, we know, 98% of the population. But there were more members of the third estate than there were from the nobility or the clergy. So let's say, so it's still disproportionate power in the hands of the other 2 estates, but it's been brought closer to fair. But when a bill, so our hypothetical bill, the clergy by a majority of 1 had voted in favor, yes. Nobility, same thing, yes. 2 yes votes, so it's already been decided basically. But let's say it's happening at the same time. And for sake of argument, let's say all of the many hundreds of members of the third estate that were there all vote no. And there are more of them than there are the nobles and the first estate, except for that only counts as 1 no vote. So it's 2 to 1 yes, and whatever the yes was for becomes law. And this is almost always the way it worked. It was either 2 to 1 or 1 to 2, with the first and second estate always on the same side, and the third estate by itself on the losing side. Why? We already know why. Because most of the members of the first estate here, there were some average priests, were nobility. And they came from the same families. So first and second estate are in a way the same thing. And clearly this was by design, so that the nobles stayed in control. But that is the very reason why the third estate, its leaders here at the Estates General, would not let the proceedings go forward unless and until the voting system was changed to make it more just and more equitable, more democratic. And they got bogged down arguing, debating this. The monarchy and Louis XVI's representatives, ministers, were not about to give in, neither was the third estate. So this impasse was only settled, it wasn't really settled, but was only stopped when the members of the third estate decided, we're going to form our own institution. We're going to go somewhere else and convene meetings there. And the question at the bottom right, did the monarchy have any clue what awaited them? We already kind of dealt with on the last slide. It appears not. Because they were there to deal with the financial crisis almost exclusively, and they never even got to it before this thing kind of collapsed. So the members of the third estate who had gone to the Estates General to be part of this large conversation and debate, trying to settle the issue of taxation and revenue, now moves to a different building and gives themselves a name, the National Assembly, and pledge to themselves that they won't go home until they have a new written constitution. And that's, of course, a paraphrase there. And by the way, they said it in French anyway. So this isn't word for word. It's a joke. That's why there's a little smiley face there. But they pledged that we're not adjourning. I don't mean they never went home and or their hotel or their rooms to bathe or sleep, but they weren't going to go back to their home city or region of France, department of France, until written constitution was completed. But wait, what? They didn't have the authority to do this. That's right. So this is, in a sense, the first moments of revolution. They had no legal right to write a constitution, but they decided we're doing it. And if you want to stop us, in a sense, they're saying go ahead and give it a shot. And over time, this wasn't clear what was happening at first. Who was in control? Who was in power? This certainly led to instability for quite some time. Because the king hasn't been pushed aside or hasn't stepped down, hasn't abdicated, and the National Assembly here is new, and it isn't immediately claiming the right to govern, but gradually, month after month, it became the de facto government of France. with Louis XVI still hanging on and at least theoretically being part of the equation. Because at the start anyway, here, and for a couple of years, the plan was to write a constitution, a new one, but not overthrow the monarchy, just turn it from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional monarchy. And so they had every hope and desire to rule alongside Louis XVI, and he'd still be a relatively powerful king. We know constitutional monarchs can be such. William of Orange, William III of England, was still powerful, even though he shared power with Parliament. But of course, absolute monarchs aren't always wild about this, and in Louis XVI's case, that's true. So he, number one, is often questioned by, historians question him, not literally, by asking why didn't he make a move like militarily to sort of just squash this thing before it really got off the ground. And he did have troops that sort of moved in and around to Paris, and for a time it looked like there might be a bloody backlash, a crushing of this whole thing before it really started. But he didn't make a move, at least in the big way, in the end. Why? Was he timid and cowardly? That's sometimes thought. Some historians still kind of present it that way in part. But I think it was clearly also that he was being prudent. So in some ways he made the right decision, because what he's seeing is this assembly, which is the beginnings of the French Revolution, has the overwhelming support of the populace, particularly the people of Paris, where they were. And so he thought, if I make a move now and it fails, then I'm in real trouble. So I'm going to bide my time, act like I'm going to go along with this, and nod my head and say, yeah, I'll be the constitutional monarch. And so he tried to make it appear that he was on board with the project to bide time while he was planning and plotting. And he was planning and plotting. We have evidence that he was. So he was not playing... he wasn't on the up and up with the assembly, that's for sure. And they suspected as much, though they didn't have evidence at the time, because his enthusiasm for it was always sort of lukewarm. He apparently was a bad actor, or just couldn't sort of get himself up to really making this sort of look good. So from the beginning, there was concern that he seems to not really. His words are saying that he's supportive of a big change in French government going forward, with him now as a constitutional leader, not an absolute one. But it didn't seem sincere, and it wasn't. In the new assembly, about 1,200 representatives were of the Third Estate. I'm sorry, 600 out of 12, so about half. About 300 nobility and 300 clergy. But wait a minute. Why did some nobles and clergy show up at all? Weren't they on the other side? For the most part, yes. But there was a percentage. I think I mentioned this when we talked about the Enlightenment. About 25% in France. 25% of the nobles in France were enlightened nobility, which means they were open to reforms and changes in a rational, modern direction. And so this roughly 300 nobles that participated in the National Assembly, most of them did so because they believed that the changes were right. They were doing what they believed was the right thing, even though they knew that it would take away some of their privileges, but they just believed it was the right thing to do. But also, some of the nobility, as is true of the clergy that were there as well, were there to kind of spy and to mitigate any damage done. So if they're at least there, even though a minority, and saying they're going along, but they're really on the king's side, they can see what's going on as it's happening, and they can also try to kind of water it down through their influence. So this is how you see some members of the First and Second Estate showing up, as members of the National Assembly as well. But this is now an elected legislature that's governing France. So it's a radical change already, even though they didn't claim the mantle of government at first. It again evolved into that. already from the start, or at the start, the people of Paris had a huge outsized role in what happened in the revolution. I mean, the people in other cities did too, but since Paris was the capital, were national events, right? The laws emanating from Paris governed the entire country. The people of Paris had an inordinate impact on the revolution. Simon Schama, whose book we saw at the outset on the screen, a great book called Citizens, said from the first year, 1789, it was apparent that violence was not just an unfortunate side effect from which enlightened patriots could selectively avert their eyes. It was the revolution's source of collective energy. It was what made the revolution revolutionary. So remember that even the way we've divided this up, moderate phase of the revolution, radical stage of the revolution, the way Professor Perry does as well, makes it appear that it's only the latter part of the revolution, the latter half, that's violent. One of the things Schama really works hard to demonstrate and illustrate in his book is that that's just not the case. Yes, it got much more violent in the radical phase, but he's saying it was plenty violent from the beginning. In fact, it couldn't have happened. None of this could have happened without violence or the threat of violence. Sometimes the threat was what did it, sometimes the actual violence. To keep order in Paris, and similar things happen in other cities as well, we're focusing almost exclusively on Paris. So keep in mind, this is happening all over the country, in Lyon and Bordeaux, all these other places. But we're sticking to the more famous events here because it was the center of impact. But this is a national revolution. But there needed to be order because there were already riots in the streets, mobs of people taking advantage of the situation, sometimes just for their own greed and theft. It was a problem. Sometimes they're involved politically on the side of the revolution. So a national guard was formed, which was kind of the police force then of Paris, under the command of a French military hero, the Marquis de Lafayette, who was famous not just in France, but already famous in the United States, because he's one of the officers, when he was young, who went to the colonies, the American colonies, to fight alongside George Washington's Continental Army against the British. So, and Lafayette and Washington remained friends, at least in correspondence with each other for the rest of their lives. So Lafayette was a French hero and put in charge of the new National Guard. He was an example of an enlightened nobleman, that minority of about 1/4 of them, who supported the early stages of the revolution when it was still moderate, and believed that it's right for nobles to give up some of their privileges from an enlightened perspective, things that don't make sense from a rational perspective. So he was a worthy choice for that position for all those reasons. But the National Guard was caught somewhere in the middle. Were they protecting the people from the government, or protecting them from rioting revolutionaries, or both? It wasn't entirely clear. And maintaining law and order cut in a couple of different directions. So Lafayette we'll hear more of. Probably the single most famous event in all of the French Revolution is this one, the fall of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789. This is such a big event in French history that it's still a national holiday today. It's kind of like our 4th of July, and it's literally 10 days later. But this is when it happened, so the French still celebrate Bastille Day every year. The Bastille was a former fortress turned prison, and a hated symbol of the tyrannical absolute power of the monarchy. Lots of political prisoners had sort of been housed, detained, imprisoned in this fortress/prison over the decades. Although this picture of it, as is true in every picture of it that I've ever seen, makes it look much bigger than it actually was. So, but this is because artists after the fact, sometimes a long time after the fact, usually French, were sort of trying to picture this in the most ominous form possible. They're kind of playing politics and looking at the Bastille from the Third Estate side, from the Revolution side, not from the monarchy or nobility's side. So this makes it look much more impressive than it actually was. So the Bastille had a symbolic importance, certainly then and ever since, in popular memory. Right, so this is why even now this is sort of seen as, because the revolution is basically still popular in France, because the French see it as really the beginnings of their democracy. Although, as we'll see, France had a long way to go before it actually got to real democracy, or at least stable democracy, without taking lots of twists and turns beforehand. And we'll talk about this as we go along. Also, it's arguable whether the French Revolution, at least the early stages here, were the beginnings of democracy. You can, and some historians have argued, that it held back democracy more than helped it. So that's open to question as well. But members of the National Guard and average shopkeepers from Paris, armed, usually with pikes and not guns, but they went to the Bastille and forced their way in, because they heard there were arms stored there, and they believed that an attack from the king's troops was imminent, which ended up not coming, but they didn't know that. And so they busted into the fortress, killing its guards, its commandant, and whose head, and there are a couple of other heads, that they severed and carried around on pikes the rest of the day through the streets. You can see a rendition of that in the upper right. So this gets us back to Simon Schama's point that the revolution was about violence from the beginning. And this is already, again, a frightening sign. The first big, at least a violent event of the revolution saw the commandant of the Bastille's head being carried through the streets of Paris on a pike. So this already gives us a sense of gravity of the situation, and a sign of things to come. Also, around the same time, the violence spread into the countryside, and something known as the Great Fear. So this is the only moment where we talk about things going on sort of outside of Paris, because this is kind of across the country. But it spread to the countryside partly because nobles many of them, not all, are taking off and leaving their estates because they know it's unsafe. It's surprising how many of them stick around till deep into the revolution. Some of them even still get out in the radical phase, reign of terror, etc. Some of them don't get out, of course, but some of them already saw the handwriting on the wall and said, "We're getting out of here." And peasants, right, long aggrieved, often angry at nobles, particularly if it's their noble, meaning the one they have to pay taxes and rents to. They break into their now abandoned chateaus and bust them up in a spirit of revenge and anger and kind of paybacks, and light them on fire. They particularly burned down rooms that kept records. Why? Because the records showed how much that particular peasant, or the peasants in general, owed the lord or member of the nobility. So without the records, they don't owe him anything any longer. So they took care to burn down not just the homes indiscriminately, but also the offices where paperwork records were kept. As it says from Perry, our textbook, our beloved author, inflamed by economic misery and stirred by uprisings of the Parisians, peasants began to burn manor houses and destroy the registers on which their obligations to the lords were inscribed. And goes on to say, the flames of the peasants' insurrection, uprising, were fanned by rumors that aristocrats were organizing bands of brigands to attack the peasants. The large number of vagrants roaming the countryside helped trigger irrational fears. Convinced that aristocrats were plotting to block reforms, the peasants attacked the lord's chateau with even greater fury. So, absolutely convinced that the king, the aristocrats, were going to send sort of these bands of kind of outlaws to deal with the peasants violently, when they saw another group sort of ahead of them, or in one direction or another, armed, they often assumed that they were, oh my, this is it, here they come. And time and time again, it ended up being just another band of peasants going around looting and pillaging. So the Estates General got to work by the summer of 1789 and accomplished a number of things while writing a constitution. So the long-term project is writing a constitution, but they have some other things to take care of at first or along the way. So the night of August 4th, 1789 is a big one in French history, certainly in the history of the Revolution. When an event is referred to by its date, it's got some importance somehow. But in one astonishing night of legislation, noble privilege in France vanished. Remember, there were dozens and dozens of laws and separate privileges, all of which have been complained about by the peasantry for a long time, increasingly so, and now, just coming out of the woodwork because they have an opportunity to do this without any fewer repercussion, at least for the time being. So it's all swept away in one night. One proposed bill after another that gets voted through by majority vote. And the enlightened nobles not only were involved and tended to be voting to take away their own privileges, but there seemed to be this sort of frenzy of competition between the nobles to give away more and more of their privileges. Meaning one would stand up and say, I propose that we give away, we legally do away with this privilege. And they'd vote on it and say yes. And then another one would join. I vote to say, I favor a motion that gets rid of this privilege, which would be kind of a bigger one. And so they're kind of competing with each other to give away their own privileges. Why would that be so? Well, it's not entirely clear. I think some of the answer is probably psychological, and that is that the nobility, outnumbered in the room, as they always were, even though they were on board, were probably concerned, and this is probably true, that many of their fellow members, but who were people from the Third Estate, didn't trust them, suspected their motives, suspected they weren't true revolutionaries. So some of this probably had something to do with nobles feeling like they have to show, sort of make an extra show of their credentials because they're not members of the Third Estate. Nobody's going to question the Third Estate members, politicians' motives, but these guys are already seen somewhat suspiciously, and some of them seen suspiciously, rightfully so. But this is one of the explanations, I think, surely, but there are others we can get into as well. One of the nobles on hand, whose fellow friend and fellow nobleman and friend was the speaker. He's the one gaveling people, in and out of talking, speaking, etc. He scribbled a note on a piece of paper and handed it down to his friend, saying, "Dismiss the meeting. They're all out of their minds." He meant his fellow nobles. And he himself, I forget the guy's name, he was a high-ranking member of the nobility who was enlightened. He was on board with giving away, voting away privileges, legislating them away, and was on board at least with the moderate revolution, which was radical for the time anyway. But even he thought this is going too far. This is madness, that there's such a fever to get rid of privileges so quickly without really thinking about it, and that's certainly what was happening. Another major accomplishment of the Assembly in its first year is the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, the death warrant of the old regime, as one historian phrases it. And this in some ways was. But it was a statement of principles, a mission statement of sorts. I hate that phrase, mission statement, but it makes the point. So they're laying down their principles, their values, what the revolution's about. So it's kind of an overall blueprint, a guide, more in a general symbolic sense, again, more in the philosophical sense. This is kind of the philosophy behind what we're doing. And there's no doubt it was influenced by the Declaration of Independence, undoubtedly, in both its wording, right, liberty and equality show up, and its, again, political values. As Professor Perry says, it expressed liberal and universal goals of the philosophers, meaning the Enlightenment thinkers, and the particular interests of the bourgeoisie, the middle class. In proclaiming the inalienable right to liberty of person, to freedom of religion and thought, and to equal treatment under the law, the Declaration affirmed the dignity of the individual. It asserted that the government belonged not to any ruler, but to the people as a whole, and that it was its aim was the preservation of the natural rights of the individual. So as far as that goes, this does seem in keeping, not only with Enlightenment thought, but with more responsible revolution that was carried out on the other side of the Atlantic, the American Revolution. So this is why historians refer to this phase, part of the reason why, as the moderate stage of the revolution. Again, it was radical in the sense that it had just basically told the king, we're writing a constitution and we'll make you, still somewhat powerful, but we're going to call the shots about how the government's going to be run from here on, and the constitution that's going to make that happen. So that part's still radical, but their overall goals and designs were at this point still within the realm of reason, within the framework of Enlightenment thought, etc. Sort of the third major accomplishment, if you can call it that, of the National Assembly in the early part of the Revolution, again, while they're still working on a constitution, which is their bigger ongoing project, was the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in 1790. So now we're about a year into the Revolution. This was extremely controversial. Maybe the most controversial part was that it forced the clergy, all, whatever rank they were, bishop, priests, archbishop, whatever, to take an oath of loyalty to the new revolutionary government. So it shows you that by this time the National Assembly was thinking of itself as the government, even though they still were planning to have the king sort of in as a constitutional monarch eventually, once the Constitution was finished, and once all the the new government that they're designing is ready to go. But about one half of the clergy refused to take the oath of loyalty because, remember, traditional Catholics and saw their ultimate loyalty to the Pope, at least in a religious sense. So this went against their values and went against their principles. So half refused to sign, take the oath, and they lost their jobs. So about half the clergy was replaced. This caused enormous unpopularity, for the new government. Many peasants in the countryside were traditional Catholics and didn't think it was at all appropriate to make church members, or church leaders, I should say, take an oath of loyalty to the government. So a real conservative impulse kind of kicked in here, not just from the clergy themselves, but from the mass of people in France. So the revolution lost a lot of support, or at least was looked at more suspiciously than would have otherwise been by such people because of its messing with the traditional Catholic Church. It also, and this was not uncontroversial to be sure, confiscated an enormous amount of church property. And much of that property was then given or sold fairly cheaply to peasant farmers, poor people in need. This was a smart move, actually, so it's hard to say whether this was good for the revolution or harmed it, because these policies cut both ways. Because the land that was given or sold to peasants makes those peasants that acquired land through the new government absolutely forever loyal to the government, because they know that if the king comes back into power, back as an absolute monarch, and the revolution fails, that land's going to go right back to the church, as it would have. So the revolutionary government was smart in that sense because it created completely loyal followers among those who benefited from the confiscation of church property. But it's hard to know, we don't have statistics, whether they gained more supporters that way or lost more, net supporters because of the unpopularity of the oath of loyalty. Which brings us to Honor Gabriel Comte Mirabeau. I have to work on my French accent. I actually spoke French at one time, but it's very, very rusty. So Mirabeau was one of the great leaders early in the Revolution, and he typifies the moderate phase of the Revolution. He was a nobleman, enlightened nobleman, who's sort of on board with the kind of changes that are in motion, but wouldn't be and wasn't wild about going further. So pro-revolutionary Enlightenment noble, pushing for a constitutional monarchy. He was a great speaker, commanding presence in the assembly. The picture shows it a bit, but he had this huge head apparently, and this like big shock of hair, and just kind of this gigantic, imposing figure. And he's one of many, but one of the standouts for sure in an assembly that became quite lively in terms of its oratory, debate, political theater. This is, in a sense, modern politics, or at least glimpses of modern politics, where we start to see in democracies, this isn't a democracy certainly yet, but it has some of the trappings of it, but where oratory becomes kind of an art form and a big part of how you get things done politically, which isn't as true in our system any longer as it used to be earlier in American history for reasons we won't get into. We now know that Mirabeau, again a member of the nobility, was secretly counseling the monarchy and the king to try to achieve compromise, and we're not entirely sure what he was up to. It appears that he was probably on the up and up in his support for the revolution and what he was saying in the assembly, though he was secretly keeping it quiet from everybody else counseling the king. But it's possible, maybe likely, that he was counseling the king to go along and showing the king why it would be a good idea to compromise here. But he's been seen differently by different scholars, and so there's still a debate about him. Was he a great leader who almost saved the nation from dangerous radicalism? So he kept the revolution moderate and kind of on track, kind of the responsible revolutionary, like your Alexander Hamiltons and George Washingtons, Thomas Jeffersons? Or was he a demagogue lacking values, right? A politician just manipulating the public for his own advantage? Or was he actually a paid kind of spy of the enemy, of the nobility and monarchy? We'll never entirely know. I think it's most likely that he was actually a true moderate revolutionary and was trying to counsel the king, but he knew that passions were so intense already against the monarchy, even though they were still planning, keep repeating, to keep the monarchy alive, that he probably realized if I do this openly, I'll get denounced and probably forced out of office, if not worse. So I'll have to do this quietly. He was taking risks. By the way, he died, you see the upper right, right in the middle of all this, of some sort of gastrointestinal thing. I think we know the disease, but I forget what it is now. At any rate, it doesn't appear that there was foul play involved, though it sounds like a suspicious death given the timing. But it does appear that it was an accident. So one of the great leaders is gone. Could he have changed the course of events and kept the revolution from spinning out of control? Possibly, but I don't know if any one person had that power in this series of events.